you bring a point that's crucial, that it's with small action of civil society that we start to create this network, this web that will at one point influence politics. People usually come often to us to ask, but what can I do in my daily life? And when you give them a small task, they think it's irrelevant. No, but they have to understand that it's very, very relevant to change this cultural aspect that's impeding understanding and consensus.
Every one of us has that power, because in every family, I can say, sir, here, and I'm pretty sure it's true in Brazil, you have people with different political opinions and so on. Sit down with someone who disagrees with you. And instead of just telling them what you think and what you think they should think, listen to them and say, tell me more. I'm curious. Bring, the great power of curiosity, which is the way to meet animosity, is with curiosity. And just listen. Oh, that's curious. That's interesting. So that's why now I begin to understand. And once you've listened to them, guess what? They might be more willing to listen to you. And then you start to shift the relationship. And so it's not about, you don't have to persuade them to change their mind. It's very hard to change a human mind. That's not your job. Your job is to understand their mind and let them change their own mind. And the way that people change their own mind is when they understand you and they see that you treat them with respect, then they say, well, maybe I won't be so quick to judge the other side. That's how things change. And so every one of us has that power, because every one of us has immediately around us in our families and our close friends, people who take a very different political opinion than we do.
And I think you touch a point very, very important, which is you have to have an inclusive mentality. You have to try to understand the other side and not just talk with your own tribe, with your own people, because then dialogue becomes destructive. You're not engaged into a constructive dialogue. So this is a point that you always mention in your book, that the major point of a destructive thing is the exclusion. No, we don't want to talk to you. We don't want to listen to you. And this creates a reaction very quite negative of disengagement. So what techniques can we implement in our daily lives to be more inclusive? Because it's interesting, in a polarized world, to be inclusive, you can be perceived by your stakeholder as a so-called traitor. Why are you talking to them? So you're a fan of the other team, you're not with us. So how can we exercise this inclusive mode without losing the support and the respect of our stakeholders?
Well, that's a really good question, and it happens. And the thing is that the wound at the core of almost every conflict I've ever been involved in, there's the wound of exclusion. Like take the Middle East right now, the Israelis and Palestinians. The Palestinians feel deeply excluded, and the Israelis feel deeply excluded. It was the same thing. So it's like, and the simple act of inclusion, going back to, you mentioned Anwar Sadat. He had the boldness at a time when no Arab leader would even mention the name Israel. I mean, total exclusion. He said, you know what? I'm willing to go and fly all the way to Jerusalem and speak in the parliament of my enemies and tell them what I think. And when he went there, he didn't say anything different than he'd already said in Cairo. He was just as strong. But by acknowledging the other, overnight, it changed the atmosphere and created the atmosphere in which a Camp David was possible. So that simple, bold act of flying to Jerusalem. So I often like to ask, okay, what would be the equivalent in any conflict of flying to Jerusalem? In other words, it might be, between a husband and a wife, bring you a flower, some surprising act. Could be a very small act, but just to begin to include, because every human being wants to belong. It's a basic human need. Every human being wants to be respected. They want to have their dignity respected. The cheapest concession you can make in a negotiation, it costs you nothing, but means everything to the other side, is to show them a little respect. It costs you nothing. You know, I've talked to like professional, like hostage negotiators. What's their secret? They treat the hostage taker with a little bit of respect. Why? To try to persuade them to release the hostage. That's why. But it's like just human respect is the key. Now, of course, you have to be careful about how you do it because it might be perceived by your constituents, as you said, as being a, quote, traitor. So the first thing you need to do is sit down with your constituents and listen to them. Make sure that you have them on board, that, you know, and you can explain to them you're going to talk with the other side. Why? To figure out, to try and understand the phenomenon, because it's like, even in warfare, even if you're trying to kill the other side, you know, the first rule of strategy in warfare is know your enemy, right? Know them, right? You know, it's like, so even if it's like just collecting intelligence, you know, which you could explain to them, of course you want to know them. But so it's like, it just makes sense. I mean, you know, in negotiation, you're often trying to change the other side's mind, right? We'd like their other mind to change. How can you possibly change someone's mind unless you know where their mind is? And how can you know where their mind is unless you go and listen to them? So it just makes absolute strategic sense. It's not even like you could justify it morally, of course, but you could also just justify it strategically and say, it's just important for us to be able to understand where they are so that we can develop our message better or whatever it is, but explain it to them so they know what you're going to do so they're not surprised when they suddenly find out that you're talking with, quote, the other side.
Bill, one important point today is the relative deception of people with democracy. It seems that democracy is not delivering more the fruits that used to deliver in the past. And how can we rebuild trust in democracy? Should we start with civil society? Should be an act of the business? Should be a position of certain politicians to show that without democracy, we're going to go nowhere? So how can we revamp the trust in democracy at this moment that democracy has such a low reputation?
I'm going to come back to a very simple word here, which is listen, which is it's time for leaders and politicians to go listen to their constituents. Because oftentimes, you know, they think they know what their constituents want, they're just fighting for their, you know, whatever they're doing. But like humbly go and sit with your constituencies, listen to them. What's on their minds? What are their daily concerns? Is it the price of eggs? What is going on? Because democracy is a means of trying to deal with the basic concerns of everyday people. And you're not going to just learn it by polls or from a distance, but really listening to them. You know, it's that kind of grassroots listening in democracy that you'll learn what does it take to rebuild people's faith in democracy, which is key, which is absolutely key. And the other answer goes back to what you said before, it's civil society. It's like democracy isn't just, you know, the institutions and the elections and the votes. It starts with the links among civil society so that every one of us at a grassroots level can start to build and rebuild the sinews of democracy that exist in everyday associations. It's what, you know, when de Tocqueville came to the United States, you know, back in the 1830s, that's what he noticed was there were so many civil associations. That's how democracy got strong. It came from that foundation of those everyday connections among human beings. It's not just the abstract institutions that go into a constitution.
And I think one point that I would add is that if you want to really listen to people, don't come with all your package of answers, because if you come with your package of answers, you're not listening to people. You're trying to reestablish your reputation or your authority, that you are, authority in that subject. And I think perhaps this is a big change in our attitude once we really want to listen, when we really have to engage in a dialogue with another person.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. And listening doesn't mean, oftentimes when we listen, we hear the words. We listen to the words, and in our minds we're saying, okay, how am I going to make the best response to that? That's a very superficial kind of listening. The best kind of listening is when you listen not just to the words, but what's behind the words. What are the feelings? What's really generating that? You're curious. You bring a spirit of curiosity, and the focus goes from what's in your mind to what's in their mind and what's in their heart. And try to put yourself in their shoes. Imagine that you were them. If you can listen from that perspective, you're going to learn a lot more about them. And that's deep listening. And that's the key to listening, is to listen from the other side's perspective, not just from yours. To listen, not to refute what they said, but to listen to understand where they're coming from.